Hi, this is Margaret from the CBM. In this video, we're going to address some of the historical background for understanding Dr. Schiffer's work. So to start with, one of the first proteins she looked at was HIV protease. And as you may know, in the 1880s, HIV became a disease that we didn't know the cause of, and eventually researchers were able to identify the HIV virus as the cause of the disease. And then a great deal of researcher time and effort was put into identifying drugs that would target the HIV virus. And because HIV is a persistent infection, meaning that once you have it the rest of your life, you have to continually be treated with the drugs. And as we mentioned before, the more you expose a virus to a particular drug, the more the drug selects for those viruses that are most resistant to it, that then survive and reproduce. And over time, the virus becomes resistant to the drug. And this is evolution. It's not a virus just suddenly, I'm resistant. So a population of viruses becomes resistant over time. And so by the turn of the century, around 2000, just when Dr. Schiffer was finishing up all of her training and starting her own research lab, we already had a number of strains of HIV that were resistant to the drugs used to treat them. And Dr. Schiffer's training in structural biology and in biophysics made her an ideal person to begin to explore how to design drugs that are going to be less likely to be targets for variation by the viruses designed, that the drugs are designed to treat, so that they don't become resistant to the drug. And the approach she used is one I want to share with you. And it's a theory she came up with called the SubstrateEnvelopeGuided Design. It's worked very well, not only for HIV, but she has done work with hepatitis C virus, influenza virus, cancer cells, and now she's also working with dengue fever. So wide-ranging applications here. And I'm going to kind of show you some of this by looking at some basic illustrations. So this pink shape is going to represent the protease. The green stars represent the catalytic site. You notice there's this nice big binding pocket where the substrate has to enter in order to be reacted on by the protease. And in this image, we've got one of the substrates. You notice the substrate fits in the binding pocket. It interacts at the catalytic site so that the enzyme can act on it. Here's a second substrate. It also fits in the binding pocket, but you notice it doesn't have exactly the same shape as the first substrate. And in a way, this is kind of cool because the enzyme can operate on several different substrates. And basically, they have to fit somehow in this binding pocket, and they have to interact at the catalytic site. So, of course, then the idea for structure-based drug design is that we want to build an inhibitor that will fit in the binding pocket and either interact with the catalytic site or in some way block the catalytic site from reacting with a substrate. So here's our rational drug design goal. We want to fit in the pocket. We want it to fit at least as well as or even better than the substrate, and we want to block access to the catalytic site. So here's a substrate. You notice, an inhibitor. And this inhibitor, you'll notice, does not actually interact with the catalytic site, but it blocks any access to the catalytic site. So this is one of the inhibitors. It binds really well, in fact, better than any of the substrates, along this right-handed side of the wall, of the binding pocket wall. Here's a second inhibitor. It doesn't bind very well at all along the right side of the wall, but it binds really tightly along the left-hand side of the wall, as well as outside of the pocket. So this has a good tight binding, and this inhibitor actually binds at the catalytic site. Well, as I mentioned, over time, exposure to these drugs with the ongoing air-prone polymerases, the HIV produced a variety of variants. Natural evolution, because of the environment, they're more likely, if they're exposed to the drug, those progeny that have a variation that makes them resistant to the drug will survive. So over long-term exposure to the drug, the viruses that survive are more and more resistant to the drug. So this is where Dr. Schiffer started, how to design a better drug. And here is an illustration of accumulations of variations over time. The variations are represented by the red stars. These variations would have occurred one after another. But you notice for this first inhibitor, the variation that's expressed in the upper right-hand wall of the binding pocket prevents this inhibitor from binding to, I know it looks like it fits in the pocket, but it just doesn't fit there anymore. You have to bear with my illustrations here. And for this other drug, it didn't bind over near the right-hand side of the wall, but the inhibitor, or the mutation, the change, the variation in the protein expressed in the bottom of the binding pocket, as well as this one that's completely outside of the pocket, both prevent this inhibitor from binding. So what was Dr. Schiffer's approach? She started by looking at the HIV protease, and the HIV protease bound to a number of different substrates. And she overlaid all of this data to determine the minimal region of binding in that binding pocket for catalysis. So here is, we had the two inhibitors, or the two substrates. We've overlaid them, and you see this yellow section in the illustration. It represents the minimal amount of binding that's required for a substrate to be acted on. And here I've colored it green. This is called the substrate envelope. So this is the minimal space of a virus, of a substrate, that's required. You don't need it to bind up here because one of the substrates doesn't bind up here. You don't need it to bind over here on the left-hand side because only one substrate binds there. Only at the section, the intersection of both of these substrates, is the substrate envelope the necessary and sufficient region for substrate binding. And I've only shown this with two substrates, but there were lots of things they could look at to determine this envelope. And next, the goal was to design an inhibitor that's going to fit this spot. And if you notice here, I've overlaid, here's the catalytic site. That green substrate envelope interacts with the catalytic site. But you notice it doesn't interact with any of the inhibitor, of the mutations that render the protease as resistant. So bottom line, the message that she identified from looking at all the inhibitors was if the inhibitors bind outside of this necessary and sufficient region for substrate binding, there's an increased likelihood that a mutation in that area of the binding that's not critical is likely to change and lead to resistance. So the way to the way to build a better inhibitor is to build an inhibitor that only interacts with the protein within this necessary and sufficient region for substrate binding. You notice that this inhibitor extends beyond this substrate envelope, but only in regions that don't interact with the protein. It interacts with the catalytic site. It doesn't interact at any of the places of these known mutants. In addition, Dr. Schiffer identified that if you added something called a macrocycle, so this is a ring substituent that you place on one side of the inhibitor, this part will not fit into the binding pocket, and because it's on the outside away from the binding pocket, it helps to orient that molecule in the binding pocket in the way you want it to. Very often when people start doing rational drug design, they design a substrate that should fit really well in the binding pocket. And then when they bind it in, it binds in a completely different place or a different orientation than what they expected. And so by adding this ring compound on the opposite side of the drug, away from where you want it to fit in the binding pocket, you help that drug to orient the way you expect it to, the way you want it to. So it keeps the drug from flipping in the wrong direction in the pocket. Okay, so the basis of Dr. Schiffer's work is that you first of all start by identifying the substrate envelope by overlapping multiple substrates in the binding pocket. Then you want an inhibitor that only, when you design your inhibitor, you only want it to interact with the protein within that substrate envelope. It should not extend beyond the envelope except in regions that aren't interacting with protein. And it should encompass as much of the substrate envelope as possible because that increases its binding potential. You also want a drug that will interact with the catalytic site. And if you incorporate that macrocycle to orient the inhibitor in the binding pocket, that will assure that you get the fit that you intended. So that is basically the approach that Dr. Schiffer uses in her lab. As I mentioned, she has worked with designing better drugs for HIV treatment, for hepatitis C, which is a massive issue. And she's been working with dengue fever, which you probably have never experienced, which is good. And most of these are things that you and I don't see, but they're massive worldwide epidemics. She's also been working with influenza virus. I hope you haven't experienced that. But if you have, you don't want to do it again, I guarantee that. And it leads to a lot of loss of productivity every year, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. So I suspect that you'll be looking at one of these viruses looking at one particular protein in the virus. And your approach might be to kind of look at substrates and inhibitors and mutations that render that particular virus resistant to those drugs, and see if you can tell some kind of a molecular story about how better drugs have been or should be designed to target those particular proteins. And I look forward to meeting with you on Zoom and finding out more about what you're interested in and seeing how we can work together to develop a really cool project for you to share with Dr. Schiffer in the spring. Thanks a lot. Have a good day. Bye.